Welcome to a prismatic examination of teaching and disability, contextualizing critical race theory through a discrit lens. I'm Dr. Kimia Sohrab Magzi. I'm a professor at the University of Redlands, and this is my esteemed colleague.
I'm Dr. Marnie Fisher. I'm at Saddleback College. So, our methodology, we use prismatic inquiry and a discrit lens for education. Discrit is the combination of disability studies and critical race theory. It amplifies marginalized voices and it focuses on crossing and integrating the complexity of lives for individuals with disabilities as well as persons of color. Discrit is a lens that should not be an afterthought or an added layer. It needs to be integrated, and it's a necessity for understanding systemically disadvantaged students and the multiple factors that are affecting marginalized students. So, prismatically, we examined the story of a single professor, and we looked at her life covering multiple aspects of her experiences. So, this starts with her role as an education specialist. The elements that showed up in her story after coding were the inherent structures of education, which influenced teacher preparation, diversity problems that emerged, as well as the transitional nature of the role.
So the problem of attrition in education, which is a problem for sustainable education development, which Barbara Tai talks about, address the examining of deep structures of education, which can make building trust more difficult. As a young teacher, I found this added a level of difficulty to my teaching. The nature of the special day classroom was also very transient. The classroom paraprofessional and aides had already seen educators from outside come and go so often, and they were skeptical of my intentions with the children and the community that I was to serve. The trend of teacher attrition is higher for special education teachers than general education teachers. Special education teachers are more likely to leave their school or profession, and more than 20% of California special education teachers left their profession between 2015 and 2017. Furthermore, schools with students from low-income areas with cultural and linguistic diversity are most affected by teacher turnover.
Another pattern that emerged was systemic inequity. The problem of the special education classroom being a dumping ground, the overrepresentation of certain populations in special education, the cultural misalignment of services with the cultures of the families, and the problem of mistrust.
So I experienced the problem of mistrust when interacting with my team, which consisted of my aides, who came from the community that we were serving. And they were skeptical of me as an outsider, which made building trust very difficult. Despite the immediate trust that families and parents had for me, the aides in the classroom did not have the same demeanor or stance. The adults, the aides who were much older than me, with much more life experience than me, were very skeptical of me as an outsider. Due to my desire to remain professional and positive, I felt very lonely. And we know that the research talks about how teachers who professionally experience collaborative relationships are much happier professionally, and educators in collaborative class uh, have increased positive attitudes towards teaching and higher levels of trust resulting from collaborative teaching experiences. These include a sense of personal support, as well as support for professional growth while building expertise and reducing the chance of burnout.
So, in order to successfully build equitable programs, there needs to be an authentic alignment of services with student needs and culture. There needs to be family connection, and there needs to be the building of trust.
What I found fascinating was the trust and respect families immediately gave me without any knowledge of me as a person. This is where I quickly learned of the trusting nature of the families I was serving.
In terms of leadership, what we found was that the values and influence of the leadership also affected how services were in the school.
What became apparent to me was the importance of leadership and their views regarding their students and their families. Serving in schools that were run by leaders who feared parents and families who have the means to pursue legal attributions and means became very apparent to me. What was even more perplexing was that leaders who came from similar cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds to the students and families we were serving were willing to take advantage of individuals with disabilities and their families, and were not being a threat to the district or school district. This was very perplexing to me.
So in coding through the interview and the data and then examining it dialogically, what we ended up mapping was this pattern of the continuum between systemic racism, hegemony, and inequality to navigating success. And inherent to this are the inherent structures of special education, such as preparation, diversity, and the transitional nature of the role. But you also have the leadership, which influences the entire aspect of the continuum and what side of it you fall upon. Next, in examining our story, what we found were patterns of her role as a parent. And this involved examining privilege.
Yeah, as a parent, I realized the complex understanding and layers of culture, which I, as a parent, recognize as my children are growing up speaking Finglisi, a combination of Farsi and English, as well as attending a dual immersion school where the dominant language being taught is Spanish. I recognize the importance of trust emerging in my story, and also I've affirmed my commitment to building trusting relationships. I recognize that a lot of parents and families in the school my children attend are from Hispanic background, and they exhibit deference and respect to the maestra or the educator and leaders of the school. And as a parent who has built trust and rapport with some of the families, Hispanic families at our school over the past 2.5 years, I recognize trust and rapport doesn't happen overnight. So power relations impact the building of trust. And as I am a parent at a school, which the dominant population of the school is Hispanic, I recognize while I am a woman of color, but I can pass as white, and it gives me a level of privilege as a parent. And I became very aware of my privilege when one Hispanic parent told me that I'm lucky to be able to go into the office and complain about a situation that affected the safety of our children. I had no idea she and many other parents felt uncomfortable complaining to the administration. I was pushed to reflect upon my privilege and the mere fact that I was able to go into the office and demand an emergency meeting with the principal after my son was injured. For me, this safety was not only an issue for my son, but for all the students in the classroom. Even the educator, who was relatively new, felt powerless to address the safety of the situation and the politics navigating the situation. I began to question what made administration so unapproachable for parents and families to complain about the lack of safety of their child.
So in mapping this,
and so there's a balance of power that supports the dominant voice that I recognize.
So in mapping this, the dominant perspective typically has a small center space, and everyone who does not share that dominant role, which could be non-dominant, which isn't a great term, the traditionally marginalized, or there's a lot of different ways to explain, but those outside of that, go ahead, say again. Marginalized. Those outside of that dominant perspective, there's a place where the power lives and the power to speak up, and the voice happens within that, if you're living or passing within that dominant role. Whereas if you are outside, there is a lack of voice, even though they are fully aware of what is going on inside the dominant perspective, which tends to be blind to what is outside the circle.
Maybe not visible or unaware, right? And then it's not that they lack voices, they've not given
There's
a
no
space
space
to amplify their voice, right?
Exactly. So the next piece of our story is the role as an advocate, as a professor. So this shows in her role as an educator, her public scholarship, her service, and her leadership.
So my leadership included creating accessible syllabi templates for faculty and students. That's something that I learned actually from my colleague, Dr. Fisher. I also updated the special education TPEs and TPAs. And I worked on creating a dual credential program to break down the divide between general education and special education, which was approved early this year at the University of Redlands. I also serve as the Faculty of Color Caucus co-convener and the treasurer and secretary of the Disability Studies SIG, which I'm so sad to not be able to physically participate this year.
So in mapping out the patterns of the different codes that emerged through the interviews, we found 4 major hubs around her role as an advocate for the DisCrit lens in education. And they center around her role as an educator, her service, her leadership, and her public scholarship. All these other aspects, they bubble outward from her role as an advocate. This is where she's a wonderful role model for the integration of DisCrit, because it is not something layered on. It is inherent to every aspect of her life, which means she's also reaching out and touching every person that falls within her sphere of influence.
I would like to add a light purple circle saying mother as well. Because even within the sphere of motherhood, I try to advocate for justice and equity. And I hold children's virtues classes on the weekends for my own children and the children in the neighborhood. So I think living a coherent life where your advocacy is not just one part of your life, but it kind of encompasses all parts of the life is important to me.
So finishing up, we're going to look at how DisCrit can help education. So as educators, leaders, and students, for an educator, DisCrit heightens awareness of 2 facets of diversity while reminding the individual to consider the complexity of layered forms of diversity. It requires systemically starting from an equitable foundation, considering the cultural capital and funds of knowledge that students bring to the classroom, and affirming that diversity, their diversity, and recognizing cultural ways of knowing.
For leaders at all education levels need to systematically dismantle hegemonic patterns and inquiry while integrating equity at the macro and micro levels.
For our,
And for
go ahead. For our students,
supporting current students across disciplines, and then supporting pre-service teachers, educators, and professors in developing their own DisCrit lens.
So thank you for allowing us to do our presentation this way, and best of luck for AERA 2023.